So I never really thought that the day would come as an adult when I was standing in my parents' living room, yelling obscenities at them, walking out of the house and slamming the door. But it happened. I'm not proud of it, but it happened. And the reason it happened was an argument that I got in with primarily my dad, because he and I are both fairly strong personalities, over medical decisions that we were trying to make for a mom who was suffering with dementia at the time. And we'll get into the whys a little bit later, but dementia tears families apart. It probably is one of the most cruel diseases that you can imagine. And this show is going to be kind of a departure from the typical plastic surgery stuff that we talk about every week. Because after dealing with this and going through this with mom, my wife and I get a lot of questions about the hows and, how we dealt with it and what we did and what we could have done differently. Because dementia is one of these diseases that no one talks about. You have a family member that get cancer and everybody seems to know about it. You start planning, you start, making, I think Tim McGraw has a song about this, live like you were dying. And one of the problems with dementia is that nobody talks about it. And so everybody goes through it feeling like they're alone and having to reinvent the wheel. And so with this show, what I want to do is kind of talk about our journey with it and then talk about things that we found helpful, things we did right, but then talk about a lot of things that we didn't do right, that we wish we could go back in time, we could do over again. Welcome to the Trillium Show. My name is Dr. Jason Hall. I'm a board-certified plastic surgeon here in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this show is designed to help you improve your mind, your body, and your life. And talking about dementia kind of fits all three of those things. Maybe not the body part as much, but certainly your mind and your life. Because dementia has a way of negatively impacting both of those things. So a little bit of backstory to where we started with all of this. Back in 2016, my dad was a surgeon here in town, and he had some orthopedic problems, ended up having back surgery. And after surgery was not able to do all of the things around the house that he could do before. Around the house growing up and after I left the house, mom did most of the house stuff anyway. She did all the cooking. She did all the cleaning. She went to the store, kept the house straight. And, and they would go shopping together once dad retired and all this. And dementia slowly started changing all of that. And we live here. I live 20 minutes from the house I grew up in where my parents still lived. And we didn't see any of it because it happened slowly. Christmas of 2018, we were over at their house having Christmas dinner and kids were there and we were opening presents and all that. And it came time for dinner and mom was a fantastic cook. My grandmother, her mother was a fantastic cook. And Christmas dinners were always this, massive spread of stuff that could feed an army, but was really made for 7 people. And we sat down to dinner that year and things weren't quite right. Things, everything, mom had this way of having everything out on the table and together at the same time. And this year she didn't. Things were still cooking, the turkey was done and the rolls were finished, but the green bean casserole was still cooking and the broccoli was still getting ready. It just something was off. And to the point that dad made a kind of a passing comment that mom had been having trouble kind of getting things all timed just right, which she had always done just perfectly before then. And we didn't really think anything of it. We're kind of like, oh, kind of getting older happens, you know. Um, Mom was in her late 60s at the time. And so we didn't really think anything of it. And it wasn't really until that next summer, so the summer of 2019, we went on a family trip to the beach. And Dad was sitting in a chair, and I was sitting behind him next to Mom. We were all kind of talking, and he asked for my mom if she could hand him his sunglasses. They were sitting on a little table right next to her, and she looked around and she said, I don't see them. I don't see where they are. And she was, sitting right there. She was looking right at his sunglasses sitting on the table. And I kind of nonchalantly didn't want to embarrass her. I was like, oh, here, Dad. And, I just grabbed him and handed him to him. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other, kind of gave each other one of those glances that you give your spouse after being married for 15 years. Like, something's not right. And so we started talking, and we said, we really need something's wrong. We need to figure out what this is. And so we took her to somebody here in town, and, we approached it with my parents, and when we were still at the beach, and my dad kind of looked at us and he said, I was wondering when you would notice. He had noticed for a long time, and this has been going on for a while. I don't know how long, but a while. And so we got them to agree to have Mom evaluated, and, MRI and mental status tests, and sitting in the doctor's office watching her go through this test and fill these, draw a clock face and remember 3 words. And it was sad and enlightening because she bombed it. It was, we learn about this stuff in medical school, and you see these like squiggly clock faces that don't make sense. And that's when I kind of realized things were not good. She was diagnosed with a form of Alzheimer's called Benson syndrome, which apparently affects more of the visual part of your brain than it does the behavior part. And so, the dementia specialist that we were seeing at the time said that it's kind of like her looking through a block of Swiss cheese. You see little bits here and little bits there, but kind of miss this bit. And we went out, my mom and dad and I went out and got a drink after we got this diagnosis, because we needed it. And we were talking, and Dad was telling me stories about her driving and pulling out into oncoming traffic and nearly killing the 2 of them. And he said something to her, and she just kind of shrugged and said, I didn't see it. Even though a car was barreling down in the oncoming traffic. And so obviously that was when her keys got taken away. And it wasn't something that she protested. She kind of knew it. She didn't like it, but she understood that it was for her safety. She was still with it enough then to understand this. So and that's something that we, people who approach my wife and I ask, like, when do you take the keys? And with Mom, it was early, right when she got diagnosed, and there really wasn't much of an argument or a discussion about it. I know that, people who have dementia that is more behavioral, and memory wise, that can be a real issue as to when to take the keys. And for Mom, it was kind of one of the first things that we did. And her dementia specialist had, recommended some treatments for, put her on some of the, dementia medications, recommended that she, stay involved, stay engaged, keep up with, social, having people around. Social engagement is really important for dementia patients. And so she encouraged her to keep doing what she was doing. She played a lot of tennis. She went out to lunch with her friends, keep doing those things. In addition to, working on things like crossword puzzles. And Mom was an avid crossword puzzle. She did crossword puzzles for as long back as I can remember. Keep doing those things. Keep reading if you can. But, that was really difficult for her because of the visual part. And recommended that she decrease her sugar intake. And Mom had a sweet tooth. So that was next to impossible. But the drugs that they had her on were, these dementia medications that are designed to, improve your memory. In our experience, they don't really work. I went back and, the doctor part of me went back and did some research, and a lot of those drugs in their approval studies are really for very early in the process. You forget where you put your car keys. You lose your wallet, even though you put it in the same place you normally put it when you get in the house. Once you get into advanced dementia, they really don't do much in our experience. And some people, I'm sure if there's a neurologist or, people who've had experience with these, you argue with me about it. But for us, they didn't do anything. And then, so that's fall of 2019, then COVID happens. And, everybody has a different experience with 2020 and what happened in 2020. We certainly have our own. In terms of family interactions, our family interactions didn't change. We didn't stop going to see my parents because of COVID. Nobody was wearing masks or, putting plexiglass up in the living room or any of this stuff that doesn't work that they were telling everybody to do at the time. But all of Mom's activities stopped. Friends stopped getting together for lunch. Tennis quit. And so it was really just Mom and Dad in the house going to the grocery store. And I think that probably adversely affected her cognitive ability during that year. The decline was pretty slow, but happened. And it wasn't really until we got into 2021 when we were seeing this gradual decline in her mental status that we really noticed a significant decrease. And kind of for us, 2021, so a year and a half after she was diagnosed, was really when everything changed. Shopping became really difficult because they would go to the store. Dad would take her to the store, and she would forget half the items that were on the list. She wouldn't see them. She would come back with things that they didn't need. And it got to a point where it was, he was riding a buggy through the store and would have to, point to things for her to get off the shelf to put in the cart, and was kind of acting as like checks and balances at the grocery store. But it really became difficult at home because, with Dad not being able to do as much, Mom had to be kind of the body, and she would go into a room and would, to get another roll of toilet paper, and would come back with, a bottle of Windex. Would put things in the wrong cabinets in the kitchen. And, you'd start finding like underwear in the kitchen drawers and things like that were, obviously not normal, but part of the disease. And that's when we really started looking at ways to get help. And, for us, this is where it gets tricky for families, because my parents were fortunate enough that they could afford to have somebody come and help. Not everybody can do that. And this is where extended family have to start taking time off. I have patients and friends that have had to quit jobs to care for their parents because it gets to a point where their parents can't care for themselves. We didn't have that issue, fortunately, but we started looking around for help for both of them. We started and interviewed a couple of home care agencies, had them come to the house and talk to mom and talk to dad, what the needs are and all this. And we started with some people part-time. Dad didn't want anybody in the house. And we started looking for people part-time, which is really hard from a business standpoint for the home care agencies. Part-time, 3 days a week, 4 hours a day. That's tough to find people to do that. And so we would get, they would send over kind of a different group of people, whoever their part-time help was. So it was somebody different every single time they came over. And dad would send people home, or they'd show up and he'd say, nope, we don't need any help today, and send them home. And so the home care stuff didn't really work for us. I'm sure they do a great job, but it didn't work for our family. And I was getting leaned on to do a lot of the home maintenance. My brother lives across country. So it was just me here, me and my family here. And I was getting tagged to, come over and change light bulbs and come over and, fix the floodlights when they go out, or, do any number of little, random home maintenance projects. And that was difficult for us. It's a small thing. I'm not complaining. I didn't have to quit my job. My wife didn't have to quit working in the office to go over and help, but it became kind of an all-consuming thing. When I wasn't at work, I'd have to run over there and help. And it started affecting our family. And and so, if you've ever dealt with a close friend, or somebody in your family, who has gone through alcoholism, you'll know that the way that you have to treat people that you love that are creating problems of their own is to leave them on their own. And so, I had to have a tough conversation with my folks that I just wasn't going to help them like that they're refusing to get outside help, and that, I wasn't going to help because I didn't feel at the time that they needed to be living in their own house without any assistance, and they wouldn't listen to having people in the house every day. And we had a discussion about moving into an assisted living facility, and they both steadfastly refused to do that. And so I said, listen, I'm not helping anymore. So we've got to either get help, you've got to go somewhere else, or you got to figure it out. And that hurt. That was hard to do. My wife and I had a lot of discussions before I had that discussion with my folks. And it was a really hard, painful thing to have to do. But then at the same time, doing that kind of forced the issue, and it let them see that they really did need, so if they weren't going to go to an assisted living facility, that they really did need help in the house. And so they agreed to having people in the house every day during the week so that the house could continue to function. They could continue to live there. And one of the questions that we get a lot is, where do you find people? And it's hard. It's not, none of this is easy. But we went to, my wife did the bulk of the searching, and, she's a saint for a number of reasons, but, she really stepped up, and helped with this part. She got on care.com, and there's an elder care section in care.com, and started calling people and interviewing. You can look at, you see their picture and their experience, kind of like, if you remember, like Match.com it's like Match.com for people to work in your house. And we interviewed a couple of people, the people that kind of passed muster with us, set up interviews with mom and dad. And we had a lady that we settled on that came and worked in the house with them every day during the week. And she would take mom shopping, and she would cook, and she would, tidy up around the house, and, change light bulbs and stuff like that. And that lasted for a little while. She ended up not working out. I can't quite remember why. But she ended up not working out, and we found another group actually of women who were all local that kind of worked together, that would split duties, because, we went from needing help during the week to needing help all 7 days. And so we had 3 or 4 women that would kind of rotate, and, someone would take Monday, Tuesday, someone would take Thursday, Friday, someone would take Wednesday, Saturday. And that worked for a couple of months. And then, gradually that number, for one reason or another, dwindled down to 2 people. A lady and her daughter, who would just take all day. And the lady that I'm referring to, her name is Angie, is an absolute saint. I can't, she's become like a member of the family. I can't say enough good things about her. But she was working kind of part-time for us, part-time for another family who had a relative who's kind of in the end stages of dementia. And that lady passed away in the middle of 2021, and Angie came on with us essentially full-time, along with her daughter. And so Angie and Lily we're working with mom and dad from then on, and they're wonderful, wonderful people. I can't say enough good. I can't thank them enough for what they've done for the family. But during those discussions, and where the story of screaming obscenities and walking out the door came in, was as mom's dementia got worse, we started really worrying, and I started really worrying about safety. I started worrying about that she was going to leave the stove on and burn the house down, or wander off when people weren't watching. Because we had, there were times, neighbors would see mom walking through the neighborhood by herself. She'd just kind of walk out the front door. And there was one day that fall that she was, or early winter, it was like December maybe. It was cold, and she was one of the neighbors who's been friend of my parents forever, saw my mom walking up the street about a half mile from the house in her bathrobe, and picked her up and brought her home. And, they had realized that she was gone, but nobody heard her leave. I had installed like the doorbell camera, so I did it backtracked and kind of figured out what happened. But we were concerned about their safety, and, started talking about memory care facilities. And dad was adamantly opposed to moving mom to a memory care facility, even with safety concerns. And that caused a rift that, short-lived, but it was an ugly scene that I you have things in your life you wish you could take back. I wish I could take that one back. But at that same time, my wife and I kind of knew that something like this was coming. And so we started looking around and interviewing memory care facilities. and going in and touring places and talking to people. And we put mom on a wait list, and you got to pay to have somebody on a wait list. So we just went without them knowing, put her name on a wait list. It's a couple months typically wait to get a room in one of these places. And so we got her on a list. And it wasn't until a month or two later that I told Dad about it and got them to reluctantly agree to go down and sit for their interview, because the patient and their family have to be interviewed to see if they're even candidates to get into these places. And they felt that they could help and that she would be a candidate for their memory care facility. And they would call us occasionally and tell us that they had a bed, and I would present it to mom and dad, and no, the time wasn't right, so we'd have to pass it up. And it wasn't until 2022, in the winter, when Dad woke up one morning. Mom was always an early riser, especially with dementia. She was getting up, she was up all night, a lot of nights, wandering around the house. And Dad got up and walked through the laundry room to go to the kitchen and saw an open bottle of Drano sitting in the laundry room counter. And it freaked him out. And he called me, and he was understandably scared. And fortunately, mom had just opened it and set it down. She hadn't tried to drink any of it. But that was really the event in our house that kind of triggered the memory care. And at about that same time, they called us and had a spot for her. And it was hard. Moving her in was hard because, when you move somebody into these places, they tell you that they've got to go through, the patient has to go through an adjustment period. So you move them in, you drop them off. It's like dropping a kid off college. You get to find out what that's like in a year or two. But then you can't go see them for 2 weeks. They're there. You can't call them. You can't go in and see them. They've got to get adjusted to their new setting. And felt a lot of guilt about it. It was not a pleasant thing. And what made that even harder was that most of these memory care, the place that we initially started at, had two kind of units in the memory care facility. There was kind of the front, which you see when you walk in, where they've got the TV, and they've got the activities, and they've got their cafeteria, and they've got their ice cream shop and all this stuff. And it's kind of nice, like a little apartment complex. And then they've got the lockdown unit in the back for, patients with severe dementia. And when we went to move mom in, and we're moving her stuff in the weekend before, we went directly to the lockdown unit. And that was, as we were moving things in, we kind of expected to be in the public area. And it was a real shock. And we talked to the administration, and they said, look, she's too advanced to be out here. She can't, and we normally don't take people from off the street directly into lockdown. These are usually reserved for people who have been here and kind of graduate into those rooms, who have history with everybody here. But, we have a bed for her, and this is where she needs to be. And we initially didn't think that was the case until she got there. And all the people in lockdown were just like her. And that was a tough realization for all of us. She stayed there for 6 months. Had a couple of instances, where she had to get sent to the hospital, the time, falls and things like that. And we learned a couple of lessons there, which I'll get into in a second. But ultimately, that facility no longer was able to kind of give her the kind of support that she needed. We ended up moving her to another one, kind of a couple miles down the road. And the whole place was locked down. And so the experience that we had it was comforting to know that she was there, that she was safe. It was really sad to go visit. It was hard to go visit. I had to make myself go, and then you feel guilty because you have to make yourself go see your mother in memory care. Because it really, at that point, it wasn't really mom anymore. Mom was gone. The person that I knew was gone. I couldn't have a conversation with the person that I was going to visit. What made her had evaporated into the ether. This was a lady that looked like mom, that sounded like mom, but wasn't her anymore. And it was hard. And there were days, I'm not proud to say it, that I was going to stop on the way home from work. And I kept driving and went home. I had every intention of going, and then I couldn't, and I was there, and I couldn't turn the car into the parking lot. And I kept going. And she was there for about another 6 months. And her mental status had kind of at that point declined to where there was a faint hint of recognition for me. She didn't really recognize my wife much anymore. She didn't recognize my kids. And then she fell. She was sitting in a wheelchair and fell out of a wheelchair and broke her leg. She was at a point where it wasn't something that we were going to put her under general anesthesia to fix. It required an operation to fix. And so we had to make the tough decision to say no. And she died 4 days later. Didn't think that was going to happen. We did a lot of things wrong, in dealing with mom's dementia. There were a lot of conversations. You'd think as a medical family, my dad's a surgeon. I'm obviously a surgeon. You would, my wife is a PA, and you would think that we would, the medical stuff we'd have nailed down. And we didn't. We screwed it all up. Yeah, they had a will. They had a living will. They had power of attorney. You had all the legal stuff taken care of. But we falsely assumed that was enough. But when the rubber meets the road, when you're dealing with somebody who's got dementia and you have a health crisis, first time mom went to the hospital, it was serious. She had she couldn't keep her body temperature up. Her body temperature is because of the, way your brain works to regulate temperature control of your body. Her body temperature dropped to down like where people with hypothermia again, like into the low 90s. And that can be a fatal problem. And we were totally unprepared to deal with that. Dad and I never had the discussion about, what to do. And he and mom had never discussed what their ultimate end wishes were. Whether mom wanted to live like that. Did she want to live in assisted living and be kept on life support? Those were never discussions that we had. We had to make it up on the fly. And it was hard. So, if going back, there's a lot of things I would have done on the front end. So I think that, if you're in this, if you find yourself in the unfortunate position of dealing with a parent or a loved one who's suffering with dementia, the best thing that advice I can tell you is you treat it like a cancer diagnosis. Because, the average, I looked this up at the time, the average dementia patient lives 10 years from the time that they're diagnosed. You have 10 years. With us, we had less than 4. And you don't know. You have no idea when the end is going to come. None of us do. But when somebody gets a cancer diagnosis, they get their stuff together. They get their affairs. They talk about, or at least I hope they do, talk about end of life. You talk about, which child or grandchild gets your wedding band? Which kid gets great grandmother's china? And more importantly, the significance of all of that stuff, the stories of them growing up, where they came from. Because with us, we didn't talk about any of that stuff. And all those stories are gone. All those stories died with mom. Her childhood, her leaving to go to college. All of those experiences are gone because we never talked about them. Her wedding band disappeared. We have no idea where that went. Did she bury it in a drawer somewhere? We don't know, but just one day it was gone. I like to think that we're going to find it one day. We may not. But that kind of brings me to another point, is when you are having people in your home, you got a patient with dementia and you have home caregivers, take an inventory of your stuff. Take the sentimental things and put them away. Get them out of the house. Not saying that anyone who came through our house stole anything. Mom may have just buried it somewhere. But things that are important, material things that are important, get those out of the house, get them put somewhere where they're not going to disappear one way or the other. Make sure your financial affairs are in order. Once mom started getting sick, it was all dad could do to help her run the house. And I ended up having to take over their finances, pay their bills and things like that, because it was just too much for them to handle. And I didn't want to see them, miss payments and have their lights or their water or their power cut off because a bill got buried or got, collected from the mailbox and put in the sweater drawer. So get all of those things taken care of early. Talk early about the end. It's a hard conversation, but have those conversations early. And it is exceedingly difficult on the primary caregiver. on the patient's spouse. They need support. They need help. They need somebody to just talk to, somebody to cry with, somebody to laugh at the funny stuff that happens. Because you're dealing with a dementia patient. There's going to be some funny stuff that happens. Some of the conversations that you have are hysterical. And it's interesting, before all this started, I don't know what I was, one of these kind of dumb things you do. I was surfing YouTube and decided that I wanted to take lessons in improvisational comedy. And so I watched a couple of videos, and it is hysterical that I used some of that in dealing with my mom when she had dementia. Because one of the things that the dementia specialists will tell you is that you'll hear some crazy stuff, and it is harder on the patient to constantly be correcting them and telling them, what they're not doing wrong. No, that's not a fork. That's a knife. You don't, but going along, or telling them, they say something, you're like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. That's, no. But going along and kind of making them, validating what they're saying. And those are the same kinds of things that you hear in improvisational comedy. You agree and then add some to it. We were talking with some friends of ours the other night who are going through this very same thing, and said it was just driving them crazy that their mother kept, a commercial would come on TV, and she would say, "Can you believe the Sonic down the street just closed?" And I was thinking, well, I mean, the answer to that isn't, I've heard that 5 times. The answer is, where are we going to get our chili dogs? Where are we going to get our cherry limeade now? And it really makes for some really funny conversations. You agree, add some more, and you have a whole conversation that makes no sense at all. But it's funny and it's endearing, and those are the things that you remember. We talked about kind of taking away the car keys. For us, that was an easy decision. It's necessary. But there are really funny things that happen when you're dealing with dementia patients. It's really sad. It's sad. It's a cruel disease. But probably the biggest thing that we noticed, and I talked to my dad after my mom had died, is that dementia is one of these things that's hidden. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to be the crazy old man or the crazy old lady in the loony bin. And so it gets ignored. You don't tell your friends, you don't tell distant family members, you don't tell anybody. It's something that's kept private. And that's probably the worst thing that you can do for yourself as a family member and caregiver. It's the worst thing you can do for the patient. We should be happy because, like I said, that this whole podcast came about because we were open with people when, say, how you doing? Like, oh, fine. Mom's got dementia and I've been going over there a lot. And so we get a lot of questions from friends of friends who are going through this, but nobody talks about it. And so everybody's kind of reinventing the wheel by themselves and kind of suffering in silence from this. And so part of the plea, if you don't take anything home from this, is, if your family member's got dementia, don't hide it. Get help, talk to people, because you need it. The family needs it. The patient needs it. And I'm sorry if you're going through it. I'm sorry. It sucks. So this was a a vast departure from the usually fun, lighthearted, carefree plastic surgery stuff. If you stuck through it this long, thanks. If you got any questions, always happy to answer. Like I said, did some things right, probably did way more things wrong. A lot more things, go back, I'd do differently. Family do differently. But reach out at drjasonhall.com on Instagram. Leave a comment. Want to talk more about it? We can do that too. Till next time.